what actually starts the cycle? What came first, the chicken or the egg, the high insulin or the insulin resistance? Well, back in a 1994 study, they did this study, really fascinating, where they took three groups. They took a non-obese group, they took a recently obese group, and they took a long-term obese group. And what they found. Hey everybody, Dr. Mark Shankman here with you again today on the Obesity Project. Today we're on episode 8, Stuck in Fat Storage Mode. And for those of you that are not too familiar with me, I'm not a physician, I'm an oral and maxillofacial surgeon, but through my own personal journey and through understanding about insulin resistance and seeing my A1C climb and having problems managing my own weight, I dove deep into this subject and came up with the Obesity Project, where I educate folks about how to eat, about insulin, about the medical profession's misguided, recommendations, and a number of other things. So just a little bit of background on why I cover this item, and that I'm not a physician. I don't treat patients on diet. But as I've gotten more and more into these videos, I've been sharing a lot more of this information with my own patients and trying to get them to understand how obesity is a hormonal problem and not a simple matter of calories in and calories out. So today we're talking about how insulin resistance fuels obesity. And so have you ever wondered why some people struggle to lose weight no matter what they try? And it's not just about willpower. It's about being stuck in a fat storage mode. That's the problem. And if you've ever been overweight, or if you've been overweight for years, you understand better than anyone that losing weight is harder for you than it is for someone who recently gained it, more like myself, where I gained it in the last several decades. But if you've been overweight all your life, or if you had childhood obesity, that leads to many, many more years of adult obesity. And the question is why? The answer is insulin resistance, and we're going to get into all of that in just a moment. So let's talk about the insulin resistance puzzle. So people who have battled obesity for years, as I mentioned, have a much, much harder time losing weight. And this is simply because insulin resistance is time dependent. Many of the studies out there, when they look at hormonal regulation and they look at calories in, calories out, they don't realize that insulin resistance and obesity is a time-dependent problem. So if you look at something in a week or in a month or even in 6 months, you're going to miss the boat. You're going to miss out on a lot of really important information. That this insulin resistance builds up over time, and the longer you have it, the worse it gets. And the other thing about it is insulin levels drive insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance creates higher insulin levels. So this creates a vicious cycle. And we're going to talk about that vicious cycle over and over and over again. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that not only do the insulin levels go up, at which causes insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance causes insulin levels to climb even higher, but if you try to do something to lower your insulin, like we'll talk more about intermittent fasting and different fasting regimens in future videos, but if you try to fast and you try to bring those insulin levels down, someone who hasn't had insulin resistance for a long period of time will drive those insulin levels down much quicker than the folks that have had the insulin resistance for many, many years. That's because this is a time-dependent variable, and it really matters on how long a period of time we're talking about. So let's talk about the cycle of resistance and why it gets worse over time. So your body craves homeostasis. It looks to create balance within your system. So this is true of all hormone regulation. This is true of all systems. When something is turned on, something else is turned off. If your thyroid hormone is turned up and now your thyroid is kind of going into overdrive. There's a feedback mechanism to kind of lower the thyroid hormone production. So everything in your body strives for homeostasis or balance. So let's look at insulin. When you look at insulin and insulin is high for too long a period of time, the body adapts by becoming resistant. And the more insulin your body produces, the more resistant it becomes. And this is where that vicious cycle comes from. So insulin is high, you become insulin resistant. The more insulin that your body produces, the more resistant it becomes and the higher the levels go. So think of it like antibiotic resistance. Many people have heard that we're using antibiotics way, way more than we should. I'm probably just as guilty of this as any other physician or doctor. But overuse of antibiotics leads to bacteria that no longer respond to the antibiotic treatment. So the bacteria gain some resistance to that antibiotic. And I won't go into the mechanism. There's some genetic transfer that occurs that creates the antibiotic resistance, but suffice it to say that the antibiotic or the bacteria pick up the ability to resist that antibiotic. And this is even more true when you don't use the antibiotic on a regular basis, or it's too short a period of time, so you don't fully kill the bacteria, or it's not at a high enough dose that fully kills the bacteria. And those that survive actually then are more resistant to the antibiotic. And those are the ones that proliferate. Those are the ones that take hold and cause the infection. So in the same way as antibiotic resistance, we can get constantly high levels of insulin, which lead to that same insulin resistance. We can also look at drug tolerance. This is a very potent and powerful example of how you build up resistance. So, like for instance, a heroin user chases that very first high. They always talk about how that first high, it was the very best. It was an amazing experience. They felt like they were on cloud nine, and forever and a day they're chasing that first high. They never can actually get back to that same feeling, no matter how much of the drug they use. And what they find is that in chasing that same first high, they're needing more and more and more of the drug. And of course, this leads to potentially catastrophic end results because you can actually overdose. So insulin works very much the same way, but it's of course a hormone. It works more like hormone regulation, but it pretty much creates the same effect. So the more insulin you have, which is spiked by carbohydrates predominantly, then the more insulin you have, the more resistant your cells become to that insulin. And so let's talk a little bit about how insulin resistance works and put it in sort of simplistic terms. So many times we're talking about sugar, but let's talk about fat storage for a minute. And so you've got this fat cell, and fat cells, the actual healthiest fat cells are very small fat cells. As the fat cells take in more fat, they become stretched. They actually can get to 10 times their normal size, even up to 20 times their normal size. And no other cell in the body can grow to this extent. But what happens is that as that cell grows and gets stretched, a couple things happen. One, the cell says, all right, if I keep accepting these fatty acids from the blood, the fat that we need to store, either created through conversion of sugar or whether we're just releasing more fat to be stored, or dietary fat that we ate. If the cell takes in any more fat, what's going to happen is it's going to burst, and the cell tries to protect itself. And so it says, you know what, insulin, I know you want me to take in more fat, but if I do that, I'm going to burst and I'm going to die. And just like our bodies don't want to die, our cells don't want to die either. So the cell, the fat cell, becomes resistant to that insulin. And so one of the other things that happens with the fat cell in particular is as it grows and as it gets bigger, it starts to release inflammatory cytokines. So these chemicals that cause inflammation. And you may be saying to yourself, well, why is there inflammation being created by a cell a fat cell that's growing very, very large. And the reason is, as it gets bigger and bigger, it's getting separated further and further away from its blood supply, the capillaries that provide blood and nutrition and oxygen and reduce and get rid of the waste. So as it gets further and further away from its blood supply, the cell goes into crisis mode and releases these cytokines, releases these inflammatory mediators that draw new blood vessels into the area to provide more blood supply, more oxygen. And the cell is starting to get hypoxic, meaning it's lacking oxygen. And the cytokines stimulate new blood vessels to grow into the area to provide more nutrition and more oxygen to that cell. So the fat cell becomes insulin resistant. The liver cells become more resistant. Your muscles, everything becomes more resistant to that insulin in an effort to sort of try to protect itself. So let's talk a little bit about some evidence or some proof that insulin actually causes insulin resistance, that it's not something that they're not separate, they're actually linked together. And the first example that I want to cover is an insulinoma. And insulinomas are insulin producing tumors. They're rare. It's a rare tumor. It doesn't happen very often, but the side effect of this tumor is that it produces too much insulin. And as those insulin levels rise, the body naturally develops an insulin resistance as a protective measure, as a protective mechanism, like I just mentioned. So if insulin resistance didn't develop, blood sugar would plummet, causing seizures and ultimately death. So the cells are actually protecting themselves by creating this insulin resistance, but the insulin resistance has consequences as well. So the solution to this problem is, of course, you remove the tumor. And as you remove the tumor, the insulin levels drops, and then insulin resistance reverses. So we can show a direct, cause and effect between insulin and insulin resistance. And this is the key takeaway, that high insulin levels cause insulin resistance. So let's talk about the vicious cycle of obesity and insulin resistance. So as we mentioned, insulin causes insulin resistance, and insulin resistance increases insulin levels. And so this is what causes that vicious cycle of obesity that you see behind me. And it's a constant state of fat storage. You can't ever burn the fat. Your body with these high insulin levels is constantly telling you, store the fat, not the fat, store the energy, whether this is glucose, whether this is fat, whether it's through the liver creating its own glucose or its own fat. So the longer the cycle continues, insulin resistance causing higher levels of insulin, which causes more resistance, the longer the cycle continues, the worse it becomes. So people who have been obese for decades develop insulin resistance that remains high even when they change their diet. So this is what's so frustrating for so many people. And this is why childhood obesity is so damaging and so dangerous, because the longer that you remain obese, the longer and the worse your insulin resistance gets. So if your insulin stays high, and we talked about in a previous video where your body's sort of weight thermometer or your set point stays high, which keeps you stuck in a fat storing mode. And this is why the fat get fatter. So the longer you're obese, the harder it is to correct, and insulin levels drive weight gain even when you eat less. So calories are not the answer. You've got to do something about the insulin levels, which is diet controlled, and we'll talk much more about that in upcoming videos. All right, so let's talk about the chicken or the egg. We talk about high insulin level causing insulin resistance, but insulin resistance causing high insulin levels. What actually starts the cycle? What came first, the chicken or the egg, the high insulin or the insulin resistance? Well, back in a 1994 study, they did this study, really fascinating, where they took three groups. They took a non-obese group, they took a recently obese group, and they took a long-term obese group. And what they found in the results of the study was that the non-obese patients, and they didn't change their diet, didn't do anything different. They just looked at these and compared these three groups. So the non-obese people had low insulin as would be expected. But here's the interesting thing. Both obese groups, the recently obese and the long-term obese, had equally high levels of insulin. But the insulin resistance developed over time. So the folks that had long-term obesity had much higher levels of insulin resistance, even though both groups had equally high levels of insulin. So what this shows is that insulin actually has to rise first, and the insulin resistance follows. And this study sort of proved that. So the main takeaway from this study is that high insulin is the initial trigger. And the longer it stays high, the harder it is to escape fat storage mode. So, have you struggled with weight loss despite doing everything right? I know I have. I've been on that yo yo diet effect. I've lost weight, I've gained weight, I've fasted, I've eaten low carb, I've done everything I was supposed to do, and still struggle with weight loss. So, if you've struggled with weight loss, please drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you, and we can talk more about this. So also, I want you to share this with someone who needs to understand why obesity is more than just calories in and calories out. So again, this video all about how insulin drives insulin resistance, that insulin resistance then drives higher and higher insulin levels, and it becomes a vicious cycle. We'll be talking much more about childhood obesity in the next video. We're going to talk about poverty and as it pertains to obesity, and then we'll certainly get into diet and much more about carbs and refinement and all of this other good stuff. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please share this with other folks that need to hear it, need to see it. I've been doing a lot more educating of my own patients, even though not my sort of area of expertise, but I understand the science and I understand how misguided the medical profession is actually right now. We'll talk much more about that as well. So thank you so much for watching. Like, share, and comment, and I will catch you in the next video.